October 6, 1941. Outside the small Soviet town of Mtsensk, 200 kilometers south of Moscow. The autumn air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and burning oil. Rain turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud, clinging to boots and tank treads alike. On the horizon, the 1st Panzer Division crept forward, steel monsters grinding eastward under the banner of the Wehrmacht. Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer, commander of a Panzer III, stood half out of his turret, scanning the tree line through his Zeiss binoculars. His radio crackled with static and clipped orders. They'd been told to expect retreating Soviet infantry, nothing more. The Red Army, they said, was broken, crushed, finished. But something didn't feel right. The column of German tanks, thin-skinned Panzer IIIs and IVs, advanced cautiously along the Orel-Mtsensk road. The engine's growl reverberated through the soaked forest. Fischer could feel the vibration in his chest. His gunner, Lieutenant Erich Bauer, wiped condensation from the gun sight. "Visibility's poor, sir. Could be anything out there." Fischer nodded. "Keep your eyes open. Russians love their ambushes." A flash of movement. A sound low, mechanical, deep, unlike anything they'd heard before. Fischer froze. From the mist emerged a shape, broad, sloped armor glistening with rain. It moved with unnatural smoothness over the churned mud, its wide tracks cutting through the terrain as if gravity itself gave way. "Panzer, halt!" Fischer barked into the radio. "Identify that vehicle." The answer came in fragments. Confusion, fear. Then a voice shouted, "Das ist kein BT-7, that's something else." The new machine rolled into view, a Soviet T-34. Its turret rotated with a hydraulic whine, the 76.2 mm gun swinging toward the lead Panzer III. Fischer felt his stomach drop. The shot came a heartbeat later, a blinding flash, a deafening crack. The German tank erupted in flame, the explosion echoing through the forest. "Reverse! Reverse now!" Fischer yelled. His driver slammed the gearbox, treads screeching as the Panzer lurched backward. Another T-34 appeared beside the first, its armor shrugging off return fire like rain on stone. The German shells bounced, sparks flying from the T-34's sloped plating. Bauer cursed under his breath. "Our shells can't penetrate." The Soviet tanks advanced methodically, firing, moving, firing again in a deadly rhythm. Behind them, infantry followed in dark coats, rifles at the ready, shouting orders in Russian. The Panzer column scattered, their formation breaking apart under the onslaught. Fischer's heart pounded. The enemy's speed was unreal, faster than any tank he'd ever seen in mud this thick. Through the gun sight, Bauer tracked one of the T-34s. "Got a side profile, firing." The shell struck the hull and ricocheted harmlessly away. Fischer swore. "Aim for the tracks." The next round tore through a T-34's tread, halting it momentarily. But even crippled, it turned its turret and fired. Another Panzer III vanished in a storm of fire and shrapnel. The radio filled with frantic voices. "We can't stop them." "Armor too strong." "Requesting artillery support." The ambush was over in minutes. What remained of the German spearhead limped back toward their lines, leaving burning wrecks behind. Fischer's hands trembled as he clutched the turret rim. He had faced French Char B-1s, British Matildas, but nothing like this. He looked, once more through the haze, at the distant silhouettes of the T-34s moving across the field, their engines roaring like thunder. He whispered to himself, barely audible over the rain, "We've been outmatched." As dusk fell over Mtsensk, the surviving crews gathered around smoldering wrecks, their faces pale with disbelief. They spoke in hushed tones, recounting what they'd seen. Every description carried the same realization. The Soviet Union had unleashed something beyond their comprehension. Fischer sat on his track, mud streaked across his uniform, and stared at the wreckage. The smell of burned oil clung to the air. In his logbook, he wrote, "Enemy tank identified, new type, thick sloped armor, fast, gun superior to ours. Recommend urgent report to command." Somewhere in the darkness, the Soviets prepared to move again, the T-34s vanishing like ghosts into the forest. The German army, unstoppable for 2 years, had just met its first real opponent. The dawn after the ambush broke cold and gray over the muddy fields near Mtsensk. Smoke still hung low, curling from the carcasses of burned-out Panzers. The air was heavy with the scent of fuel and scorched metal. Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer and his crew were silent. Their Panzer sat hidden behind a stand of birch trees, its tracks half submerged in muck. The radio crackled with distant chatter, the remnants of the division regrouping after a nightmare. A convoy of field trucks arrived to recover the wounded. Among the shaken men came Major General Heinz Eberbach, commander of the 4th Panzer Brigade. He stepped out of his vehicle, his boots sinking into the mud. His uniform was immaculate despite the chaos. The men straightened instinctively as he approached. "Report," he ordered. Fischer saluted, his voice hoarse. "Herr General, we encountered new Soviet armor. Fast, heavily sloped armor. Our shells could not penetrate." Eberbach frowned. "You mean the KV series?" "No, sir, smaller, faster, tracks twice as wide as ours." Fischer hesitated, glancing toward the wrecked Panzers. "And it moves through mud like a truck on pavement." Eberbach's eyes narrowed. He motioned to a nearby intelligence officer. "Get this man's notes. Send them to the OKH at once." That afternoon, under the thin light of the Russian sun, engineers and officers gathered around the twisted remains of one of the new Soviet tanks, a captured T-34, half buried in a ditch. They climbed onto its hull, rapped their knuckles against the armor, examined the welds, measured the angles. The tank's glacis plate was sloped at 45 degrees, something no German designer had seriously attempted before. One engineer, his breath fogging in the air, muttered, "If this armor were flat, it'd be only 50 millimeters. But sloped, it's like 80 or more effective." Eberbach crouched beside the vehicle, running a gloved hand over its mud-caked surface. "And this gun," he said, pointing to the 76.2 millimeter cannon. "It destroyed our Panzers at 800 meters. We can't even scratch it at that range." Another officer, Hauptmann Schmidt, kicked the tank's wide tracks. "It's brilliant," he admitted reluctantly. "These give it ground pressure half that of ours. It can go where our machines bog down." The group fell silent. The sound of distant artillery echoed across the plains, the war continuing as if unaware that its balance had just shifted. Back at divisional headquarters, reports flooded in. The same story, again and again. T-34s breaking through lines, surviving direct hits, striking fast, then disappearing into the mist. Intelligence officers spread aerial photos across tables, comparing wrecks, tracking sightings. Each red circle on the map marked another encounter where German units had been mauled. At the front, rumors spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered, "In trenches. They say the Russians have new tanks that can't be destroyed." Others dismissed it as superstition, but for the Panzer crews who had seen it firsthand, there was no doubt. Letters home from tankers began carrying a new tone, not of triumph, but of unease. One corporal wrote to his wife in Hamburg, "They told us the Bolsheviks were primitive. Their tanks are anything but. If Berlin does not act soon, we will be fighting steel giants with paper armor." Meanwhile, in the forests beyond Mtsensk, Soviet commander Dmitry Lavrinenko, one of the Red Army's emerging tank aces, watched his T-34s being refueled. His crews laughed and shared bread, the smell of diesel heavy in the air. To them, the victory was proof that the tide could turn. Lavrinenko climbed atop his tank, gazing westward. "They thought we'd run," he said quietly. "Now they will learn to fear the T-34. The psychological blow to the Wehrmacht was immense. The Germans had believed themselves technologically superior, their blitzkrieg unstoppable. Yet here, in the mud of Russia, they'd found an enemy machine that defied their entire doctrine. As Fischer's division pulled back to regroup, orders came down from higher command. The new Soviet tank must be studied, replicated, and overcome. Engineers in Berlin and occupied Prague were already being briefed. Plans were drawn for thicker armor, heavier guns, new designs. The birth of a new generation of German tanks in the Panther and Tiger began that very week in the stunned aftermath of Mtsensk and Fischer, meanwhile cleaned the mud from his Panzer's vision slit, the cold biting his fingers. He didn't yet know it, but he had witnessed a turning point, and one that would reshape the entire course of armored warfare. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the front line, more T-34s were coming. The reports from Mtsensk and other sectors of the Eastern Front arrived in Berlin like thunderclaps. Each after-action summary told the same unnerving tale. Our shells are ineffective. Their mobility is superior. Loss is high. In the marble halls of the OKH, Oberkommando der Heere, generals huddled under the dim lights of the map room. A large red arrow marked the German advance toward Moscow, but around it small black crosses denoted tank losses. The atmosphere was heavy, not with defeat but disbelief. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, stood over a captured T-34 report. His gloved hand traced the armor schematic, brow furrowed. "This changes everything," he muttered. "We've built our doctrine on speed, but this Russian tank moves through mud faster than our Panzer III on a highway." Beside him, General Oberst Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, adjusted his glasses. "Our intelligence underestimated Soviet industry. We assumed they'd collapse within months." Guderian's voice hardened. "And now they're fielding tanks we can't even destroy." An engineer from the Heereswaffenamt, Army Ordnance, office entered the room carrying a set of photographs, detailed images of a captured T-34 transported to Kummersdorf, the Wehrmacht's secret testing ground. The officers gathered around as he spoke. The T-34's armor is sloped at 60 degrees on the upper glacis. It increases the effective thickness by nearly 50%. Our 50mm KWK-38 can't penetrate it, even at 200 meters. He paused, letting that sink in. And its 76mm gun. It can destroy a Panzer IV at twice that distance. Halder leaned forward. "What of the transmission? Engine, is it crude?" The engineer shook his head. "Crude, perhaps, but ingenious. The diesel V2 engine gives it incredible range, and it doesn't ignite as easily as our gasoline models." Silence. Only the faint hum of an electric lamp filled the room. Then Guderian straightened. "We must respond immediately. We'll need new armor, new guns, and better mobility. The Panzer III and IV have reached their limits." By mid-November 1941, orders were issued. Develop a new medium tank modeled on the T-34's revolutionary features. The Panther project, initially designated VK-30-02, was born out of panic, respect, and envy. In Munich, engineers from MAN and Daimler-Benz studied the T-34 like a predatory animal dissecting its rival. They sketched the sloped armor, replicated the suspension, and measured every weld. Yet the Germans refused to copy blindly. They would improve it, perfect it in their own image. Still, time was not on their side. On the Eastern Front, Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer and his crew struggled to hold the line. The temperatures had plunged below freezing. Snow blanketed the wreckage of the autumn battles, and every night the Soviets counterattacked with renewed ferocity. The sound of their T-34s approaching through the blizzard became a nightmare melody, steel grinding against snow, engines roaring in the dark. In one nighttime skirmish near Tula, Fischer watched tracers vanish into the snowstorm. His Panzer's gun jammed from the cold. "Scheiße!" he spat, slamming his fist on the breech. "They move even now in this weather?" "Yeah, sir," his loader replied, breath steaming. "And they don't stop." The T-34s cut through drifts like wolves through powder, their diesel engines unbothered by the cold that crippled German machinery. Fischer's unit fought defensively, relying on anti-tank guns and artillery to compensate for their technological inferiority. Back in Berlin, Hitler was briefed personally. The Führer's temper flared. "You're telling me we are the Russians and have superior tanks?" His words echoed through the room. "Then we shall build something better, stronger. Nothing on earth will match it." That decree would give birth not only to the Panther, but to the monstrous Tigerwagen, a 57-ton behemoth designed to reassert German dominance in armored warfare. But Fischer and men like him wouldn't see those tanks for another year. For now they faced the Red Army with outdated armor and dwindling morale. On a freezing December night, Fischer wrote in his log, "The enemy's machines outlast ours in every way. We fight as best we can, but their tanks seem immortal. Command says new designs are coming. God willing, they come before we are gone." As 1941 gave way to 1942, The myth of German invincibility on the Eastern Front was already beginning to crack, and it had started with the ghostly silhouette of a single Soviet tank rolling out of the mist near Mtsensk. January 1942. Deep winter on the Eastern Front. Snow fell thick and endless, burying tanks and corpses alike beneath a white silence. The once blinding optimism of the Blitzkrieg had been replaced by fatigue, frostbite, and the constant rattle of Soviet artillery. But while soldiers like Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer froze in their dugouts, far from the front, the German war machine was moving at full speed. In factories across Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Berlin, engineers worked night and day to design a weapon that could stand against the T-34. Inside the Mann workshop in Nuremberg, draftsmen hunched over long blueprints under the buzz of overhead lamps. The air reeked of oil and cigarette smoke. Engineers argued over angles and track widths. On one side of the room, a disassembled T-34 chassis sat on blocks, captured from the front and delivered under guard. "Look at this suspension," said Dr. Heinrich Kniepkamp, one of Germany's top tank designers. Christie style. Coil springs instead of torsion bars. It's crude, but it gives the T-34 that flexibility over terrain. His assistant, young Hans Jauch, leaned closer. "So we copy it?" Kniepkamp shook his head. "No, we refine it. The Panther must be German and not a copy. We'll use torsion bars for smoother travel, but the sloped armor we keep. That is the key." On another drafting table, engineers sketched the turret design. The main gun, a long-barreled 75mm KWK-42L70, was conceived specifically to pierce the T-34's armor at over a kilometer. The philosophy was simple. If the enemy's tank is strong, make yours stronger. If theirs is fast, make yours faster. Back in Russia, Fischer's division received limited reinforcements. The new Panzer IV AOS F2, equipped with a long 75mm gun. When the first one arrived, men gathered around it as though seeing salvation. Fischer climbed onto its hull, feeling the smooth steel beneath his gloves. "Will it stop a T-34? Someone asked. Fischer shrugged. "Maybe, if you hit first." The new weapon gave them a fighting chance. For the first time, they could destroy a T-34 from the front, though accuracy and luck still ruled the battlefield. In a skirmish near Kharkov that spring, Fischer's gunner scored a direct hit on a charging T-34. The Soviet tank burst into flame, smoke curling into the frozen air. "Got him," Bauer shouted, elated, but the triumph was fleeting. Moments later, two more T-34s emerged from the tree line, firing almost simultaneously. One shell struck the Panzer IV's side, rattling the entire vehicle. Fischer barked orders. "Smoke out! Reverse! Reverse!" They escaped, but the point was clear. The arms race was accelerating. Every improvement was met by a counter. Every new tank a new challenge. Meanwhile, in Germany, political pressure mounted. Hitler himself intervened in design meetings, insisting on thicker armor and heavier guns, changes that delayed production but made the eventual Panther a fearsome predator. He demanded the impossible: speed, strength, invulnerability. Engineers bowed their heads and returned to their drafting boards, knowing that failure was not an option. At the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, test models of the new tank rolled out in the summer of 1942. The Panther's angular silhouette echoed the T-34's inspiration, but its longer gun and low profile gave it a distinctly German menace. Watching one of the first test drives, Kniepkamp smiled grimly. "Now," he said, "we hunt them." On the front, however, the men still waited. The Red Army was growing stronger. More tanks, better tactics, endless reinforcements. Every battle drained the Wehrmacht's confidence. Fischer's letters home grew darker. "They say new tanks are coming. The Panther, a machine to defeat the T-34. But every time I look across the field and see those sloped hulls moving toward us, I wonder if we're already too late." By early 1943, as the Wehrmacht prepared for its next great offensive at Kursk, the first Panthers began to roll eastward by train. Their crews watched the landscape blur by. Endless fields, frozen rivers, the scarred earth of Russia. Each man carried the same hope, that this new creation would turn the tide. Back at the front, Fischer's unit was ordered to regroup. They'd soon be re-equipped with the very machine born from their suffering, a machine inspired by the Soviet tank that had first terrified them. The T-34 had forced Germany to evolve, and evolution, in war, always came drenched in blood. July 5, 1943, dawn. The plains around the Russian town of Kursk shimmered with the faint light of sunrise, revealing a landscape of trenches, mines, and wrecked vehicles stretching to the horizon. A low mist clung to the ground. Beneath it, engines rumbled, thousands of them. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, was about to begin. Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer sat in the turret of his new Panther Ausfinder D, the machine that had been promised to end their nightmare. The tank's long 75mm gun pointed toward the east, the barrel still smelling of factory oil. Around him, rows of Panthers idled, black crosses painted over their angled hulls, treads biting into the dirt. The tank felt alive. It roared with power, a far cry from the undergunned Panzer III he'd once commanded. Fischer ran his gloved hand along the sloped armor. German engineering reborn under pressure. Now, he muttered to his gunner Bauer, let's see if it was worth the wait. When the order came, the ground trembled. Hundreds of German tanks surged forward in unison, kicking up waves of dust and smoke. The air filled with the thunder of engines and the metallic shriek of treads on hard earth. Ahead lay the Soviet defensive lines and the waiting T-34s. The first engagement erupted just beyond a wheat field near the village of Cherkasskoye. Soviet artillery opened fire, shells screaming overhead. The sky turned orange as explosions rippled through the German formation. Fischer's Panther rocked violently from the concussions but held steady. Targets ahead. T-34s at 11 o'clock, shouted Bauer. Through the gun sight, Fischer saw them. The familiar silhouette that had haunted him since Mtsensk, sloped hulls glinting in the morning light, moving in disciplined lines across the fields. The Red Army had learned, adapted, and multiplied. There were hundreds of them now. Range 800 meters, Bauer said. Fire. The Panther's cannon thundered, the recoil slamming through the turret. The shell streaked across the plain, striking a T-34 squarely on the glacis. The Soviet tank exploded, turret launching into the air like a kicked helmet. Fischer exhaled, a mix of triumph and disbelief. They go down now. Bauer grinned. Keep firing, Fischer ordered. Don't stop. The new German tank proved devastating at range. The 75mm K-42 gun punched through the T-34's armor with frightening precision. Soviet crews, once confident in their invulnerability, found themselves burning in seconds. Yet the battle was far from one-sided. The Panthers rushed into service suffered from crippling mechanical failures. One by one, tanks broke down. Engines overheated, transmissions jammed, and fuel lines burst into flame. Smoke rose not just from Soviet hits, but from German engineering stretched too thin, too fast. Engine temperature rising, shouted the driver. Fischer checked the dials and the needle climbed into the red. Keep her moving, he barked, but the machine groaned in protest. Suddenly a T-34 appeared from the left flank, charging through the smoke. It fired. The shell struck Fischer's Panther on the turret ring, shaking the crew. Damage minimal, Bauer reported, already realigning. Fischer's heart pounded. The two tanks circled each other in a deadly duel, exchanging fire at close range. Steady, Fischer murmured. Now Bauer fired. The T-34's hull split open, flames bursting outward. Fischer watched it burn and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. That machine, that very design, had forced them to become what they were now. As the battle raged, the fields of Kursk became a hellscape of smoke, fire, and twisted metal. The roar of engines and the screams of men blended into a single, endless cacophony. Above it all, the smell of burning fuel and scorched wheat hung in the air. By nightfall, Fischer's unit had advanced only a few kilometers. The Soviet defenses held. The once-feared blitzkrieg had stalled in the largest armored confrontation in history. Panthers and T-34s littered the ground in equal measure, black silhouettes against a blood-red sunset. Fischer climbed out of his tank, exhausted. Around him, the battlefield glowed with embers. He looked across the plain where so many machines lay silent and whispered to Bauer, "We built our answer." But so did they. The T-34 had met its rival, and the result was mutual devastation. As the wind swept across the wreckage, it carried with it the truth that every soldier now knew in his bones. The age of the invincible tank was over. From now on, victory would belong not to the strongest machine, but to the nation that could outlast the other. The summer of 1943 bled into autumn, and the ruins of Kursk lay smoldering across the endless Russian plain. Twisted hulks of metal marked the end of an era. Panthers, Tigers, and T-34s lying side by side, their burned carcasses indistinguishable in the gray light. For Oberfeldwebel Karl Fischer, the war had taken on a grim monotony. His once gleaming Panther was scarred and rusted, its armor pocked with dents and scorch marks. The confidence that had carried him from Poland to France and into the heart of Russia was gone. In its place remained only endurance and respect for the enemy machine that had forced Germany to rebuild its very soul of war. In a forward maintenance camp near Orel, Fischer leaned against his tank, sipping bitter black coffee from a tin cup. A column of captured Soviet T-34s rolled past, their red stars hastily painted over with black crosses. Mechanics examined them, measuring angles, counting rivets, the same ritual he'd witnessed years before at Mtsensk. "They never stop improving it," said Bauer quietly, watching the Soviet machines clatter by. "Look, new turrets, better guns, welded armor. They learn faster than we do." Fischer nodded slowly. "They built one tank for every battlefield," he said. "And we built a masterpiece for every parade." He wasn't wrong. As the war dragged on, the T-34 evolved faster than any German tank could be produced. The Soviets simplified, streamlined, and mass-produced their armor in staggering numbers. For every Panther that rolled off a German line, the Red Army fielded 10 T-34s. Quality met quantity, and quantity was winning. Back in Germany, engineers and officers debated endlessly. The Panther had proven deadly but delicate, its complexity making it slow to repair and easy to immobilize. The Tiger inspired fear but guzzled fuel and bogged down in mud. The T-34, by contrast, remained brutally efficient, a weapon of the people, forged for the kind of total war the Soviets were willing to fight. At Kummersdorf, a captured T-34 sat in a warehouse beside a wrecked Panther. A visiting officer from the ordnance office ran his hand over the Soviet tank's simple welded seams. "It's ugly," he muttered, "but it works." An engineer nearby responded quietly, "And that's why we're losing." In the bitter winter of 1944, Fischer's division fought retreat after retreat, always westward. The Red Army's T-34s seemed endless, cresting hills, bursting through forests, appearing in the night like phantoms. Each one bore silent testimony to a truth the Germans had learned too late. The future of warfare belonged not to perfection, but to adaptation. During a brief lull near the Polish border, Fischer stood by the wreck of his Panther, its engine dead from lack of fuel. He watched a column of T-34s advance over the ridge, their silhouettes backlit by the rising sun. The same shape, the same sloped armor, the same growl that had haunted him since 1941. He whispered, almost in reverence, "They built the better idea." As he and his crew fell back on foot, Fischer turned once more toward the sound of the approaching engines, that deep, steady hum of Soviet steel that had outlasted every promise of German supremacy. Years later, long after the war, historians would call the T-34 the most influential tank ever built. Not the heaviest, not the fastest, not even the most sophisticated, but the one that changed how every nation designed and fought with armor. In 1941, German soldiers at Mtsensk saw the first T-34 and realized their weapons were obsolete. By 1945, the entire world had reached the same conclusion. The tank had forced Germany to reinvent itself, reshape doctrines, and redefined industrial warfare. And though the war would end in ruins, its lesson remained etched in steel and fire. Innovation born of necessity will always triumph over arrogance born of success. As the snow fell over Berlin in 1945, T-34s rolled through the city's shattered streets, the same machines that had first appeared out of the mist at Mtsensk 4 years earlier. Their tracks clanked over the rubble of the Reich, the final echoing answer to the question the Germans had asked on that rain-soaked day. "What is that thing?"